Welcome. Today I'm here with Shiv Gaglani. He's the CEO and co-founder of Osmosis, which has now been acquired by Elsevier, which is one of the top dogs in the academic publishing space. And he's got a really interesting story. I originally found out about him through one of his Forbes articles about making an online version of an MD degree, or asking the question, how much of the MD degree can be made online. And as some of you know, I teach a course on Udemy on preparing people for the step one, and so I'm quite familiar with the whole process and how a lot of med students are actually going, skipping lectures and going out on their own and going through kind of independent video courses and question banks and flashcards from Reddit. And so this has kind of already been percolating from the bottom up. And so I thought his whole story is really interesting. And then the more I learned about him, he's just got one of the most fantastic and interesting backstories I've ever seen. So Shiv, it's really great to have you on here.
Pleasure to be on. Thanks so much for the kind intro and inviting me.
Yeah, definitely. So in one of your recent interviews, you said that starting at 5 years old, and just for people, you've gone to Harvard for your undergrad, Harvard MBA, and so we're going to go through your whole kind of background. But I thought it'd be cool to start, because you said in one of your interviews you started when you were 5 years old. Your father is a physician, and so could you kind of take us through the story? And I'll interject a little bit here and there along the way. But like, you start at 5 years old. I'm guessing your parents are kind of preparing you to be a doctor and following your father's footsteps. So could you kind of take us through that story?
Totally, yeah. I'm obviously South Asian. There's a strong predilection for South Asians to pursue higher education, engineering, medicine, and law primarily. And so my family's bent was towards medicine because my dad's a retired general physician. My mom's a physical therapist who's actively practicing still. And my sister's a dentist, and her husband's a dentist too, and they own several dental practices in Chicago. And so
And
I
I
kind
read
of
here
grew up.
that your father was actually the head of a hospital in South Africa. So he wasn't just like your average physician.
Yeah, I mean, well, definitely, he has great leadership skills. So he trained as a general doctor with a specialty. He wanted to specialize in ophthalmology, but then wound up moving the family to Africa for better opportunities. And we first moved to Namibia, which is, population of less than 2 million people, size of California. They needed doctors from all over the world to come in and help with their population management. And then we moved to South Africa, where he was given the mantle to run a hospital because he had leadership abilities as well. And so I would go to, we had childcare, but he would bring me to the hospital with him. And starting at the age of 5, as you indicate in the bio, I would just kind of shadow him, not knowing I wanted to be a med doctor at all, but just kind of seeing how what he did and how much respect he was given by patients and their family members, and then more importantly, the effect he had on those patients and family members, where I would see somebody who was sick for reasons I had no idea at the time, and then a week later see them healthy. And my dad and his nurses and fellow physicians were a large part of that. So definitely interested in medicine early on, but then the family moved to Florida. And again, because of brain diaspora, my mother was actually the one who moved us to Florida, because Florida, as an aging population, needed more physical therapists. And so they were opening the doors to physical therapists from all over the world to come in. And my mom applied and fortunately was able to get us into the US and become naturalized citizens that way. And
So
there,
how old are you at this point?
about 6 when we
Okay.
moved to the US. Yep. And yeah, mostly I grew up in Florida, 6 to 18, and Cape Canaveral, if you're familiar with the area.
A little bit.
My area code is 321 for the space shuttle, 321 liftoff.
Oh, that's awesome.
Um, and so there's where I got an interest beyond medicine into engineering too.
Okay.
And my whole goal and hopes were to combine the two passions. And that's why when I went to college in 17, 18 years old, I studied biomedical engineering. Went straight through college, 4 years, took a gap year. That gap year before I got to med school, I actually had applied to medical and business school out of college, got into both, but took a gap year where I was like, I need a bucket list. I've been studying my entire life. I'm gonna, run a marathon. My best friends were pilots. They were gonna teach me to fly. I'm going to publish this book on research. So I basically went through this bucket list, moved back home with my family,
Mhm.
and that's where I got really interested in education, actually, which wound up coming together when I started at Hopkins Med in 2011 as a med student.
And just for people who aren't familiar with med schools, John Hopkins is number two in the world, at least in 2020. I looked up the US News rankings earlier today, and Johns Hopkins is number two under Harvard Medical School, which is number one. So this is a very top med school as well. Um, so what was when you move home with your family during that gap year? How does education come to the forefront?
Yeah, well, so in the back of my mind, I've always been committed to my own education, right? Again, Indian immigrants, I saw the role education played in my family's prospects and my own prospects, being able to get scholarships and be able to afford to go to different places, plus different opportunities. Like in college is a blast. I went to Japan for a summer doing nanotechnology research
Oh
because
wow.
of physics education. I spent a summer in Chile learning Spanish and doing some health policy research. So education was really an unlock for people like me and many others. And in the year after graduating, I had been working on a book for high school students called Success with Science, where it was essentially trying to inspire and help students from all over the world who are interested in doing science research, which also was an unlock because, being able to do science research, you develop skills like perseverance and critical thinking, presentation skills, both oral and written. And you, as a high school student or a college student, are presenting to, uh, Nobel laureates or to scientists who are much
Mhm.
older than you and have to hold your own in answering those questions. So those skills really helped me years later in business too, because instead of presenting to scientists, I was presenting to venture capitalists. So anyways, I was really interested in science research and this education. How do you educate students to get them engaged with science research? And then when they have those questions, put that into like a book format. The other quickly, the other thing I did
Yeah.
during the gap year that's related was I ran SAT tutoring camps, SAT and ACT tutoring camps, which for students who couldn't afford them, as well as a couple of students. I did some private tutoring to earn some spare cash from students and parents who definitely could afford them. So it's kind of like an arbitrage opportunity there,
A little bit of pro
and
bono in there.
a little. I mean, actually, I think 80% was pro bono by
Okay.
volume, but 20% of the students paid for 100
The other
percent of
80,
it.
yeah.
Yeah. It was like again the Robin Hood of SAT tutoring is what I was thinking of. So
You mentioned
yeah,
one of
so
your
those two,
interviews
yeah, yeah.
that's some of the top school med schools now are doing no tuition.
Yeah,
Do you
yeah.
have any thoughts on that? Because that's kind of the new thing.
Yeah, I mean the median debt of a graduating medical student in the US is over $200,000. It's a mortgage. And fortunately, most physicians can pay that off when they're in practice for a couple of years.
Mhm.
But there's actually a big problem where students who graduate, maybe they don't practice or they go through 3 years of med school, not four, and they don't get their MD. Then they're saddled with all this debt. It's the college student loan crisis on steroids. And so uh, schools that we work with, fortunately, like Kaiser Permanente, New York University School, they have a lot of largesse when they start the school, and they get these donations which fund the free tuition at least for these students. So it's a good trend. In many other countries, the governments fund their doctors, right? It kind of makes sense because you need to,
Mhm.
as we say, raise line, strengthen the healthcare system. So hopefully, it's a trend that'll continue.
One of the things you mentioned on NYU is that they've gone from like kind of a lower or like a mid tier to a top tier school. Do you have any insight into that? Or I was curious what the backstory was for that.
Yeah, definitely. And again, I love that you've done this thorough research. So NYU has this great education innovation institute called the Institute for Educational Innovations, or Institute for Innovation Education, led by this physician named Mark Triola, who's a close collaborator and has been a mentor of mine. And so he, along with several others, are pioneering this approach called precision medical education.
Mhm.
So basically, trying to teach people the right thing at the right time and correlate what we're teaching med students with how they practice as physicians. And so he and his team are probably one big part of that. Then they also have gotten a lot of funding for research and for the students, as mentioned. A guy named Ken Langone, who was a co-founder of Home Depot, gave them a lot of money, and so that's obviously funded the enterprise and helped them attract some of the best students, helped them attract some of the best faculty, and that's all sort of been a flywheel for them, I think.
Mhm. The newest CEO of Harvard Management, NP Narvecker. He came from Colombia, and Colombia has also seen like a major rise in its rankings over the last 10, 20 years, and their endowment has also done well. So I just thought it was kind of interesting that like these two schools in New York City or New York are both kind of have seen this big rise lately in the last 10, 20 years. It was just kind of interesting to me. I don't know if there's any connection there, but
Hmm. I think maybe just money. I mean, because oftentimes you get enough money to these institutions, they're able to allocate it in the right ways, and then again attract top
mhm.
faculty. They get to fund them with the research centers like this institute.
I just wanted to bring up a couple kind of cool stats from your high school years because I do want to go back and also ask you about your father's influence and your mother's influence because your whole family is in healthcare, and so uh, I think there's certain things growing up you get. So I want to get to that next, but um, I thought it was cool on your LinkedIn. You had your GMAT 780, you had your ACT 36, which is the top score, and you were the only Floridian out of 15,000 and one out of 11 in the nation out of 82,000 to score perfect, and then 1,600 on the SAT. So, and then valedictorian of your class. So what were you doing? Were you just like doing SAT prep from 5 years old, or like, how do you explain all that? Because that's really impressive. I mean, that's even probably above what most kids going to Harvard get. So I know there's kind of a de-emphasis on these scores, but this is really special.
Oh, thank you. I took them, 15 years ago when I was a student, and I have to update my LinkedIn profile. But certainly, SAT, ACT prep was a big part of what got me into education. I even
Mhm.
wrote a whole book on it, as you know, and talked about the importance of not viewing these tests as stepping stones, but rather as opportunities to actually learn vocabulary. Like the reason
Mhm.
I'm able to write well with good vocabulary knowledge, without using a dictionary, is because I did all that SAT prep. So I really, even though I don't, I think there's some good reasons to de-emphasize the importance of just the static test score. I think they're really, I owe a lot to, I think, the fact that I buckled down and studied for these exams. Um,
Did you ever
I,
do
you
spelling
know,
bee?
I did spelling bee. Actually, one of my college friends is a guy named George Stampy, who's the
Mhm.
guy who won the spelling bee. His name, he was in Spellbound. He
Oh,
won.
really?
He is
Wow.
impressive. He won spelling bee the same year he got second in the National Geographic bee.
Wow.
So, also a South Asian guy, but put me to shame in terms of the ability to study and recall things. Um, yeah, I mean, I've been short a lot. Like, I don't think obviously life is not like the SAT or ACT. There's no like rubric and there's no one test, but I do still believe that some of the skills I picked up were really helpful. And
Mhm.
I would say a lot of the things that went into osmosis were founded based on the things I was using to teach SAT, ACT, and learn it myself. Um, so yeah,
So the influence of your family, your dad especially, like what were you doing different than the average student, just K through 12, um, that helped you do all this stuff? Like a valedictorian as well. That's huge.
I think the biggest predictor I can tell is how supportive and your parents are, right? Like without being helicopter parents. And so having adults, not just your parents, but I had great teachers who believed in me, right? So I remember in fourth grade in elementary school, there was a program for students, who in my elementary school, Gemini Elementary, where students who were a little more advanced with math,
Mhm.
they would actually bring in engineers, former NASA engineers, and like they'd
Wow.
come in a couple hours a week and like tutor you on some middle school type math, algebra one or geometry. And I had this guy, Ken Kirk, who came in and did that for me. And so having several adults who tell you, you're smart and you can do it, and you're actually now more like Angela Duckworth says in Grit, less about you're smart, but more about how hard you work. Those kind of things become your identity and stick with you. So back to the SAT, I didn't get 1600 the first time I took it. I actually took it twice before that.
Mhm.
I got a 1550. I was like, that's not good enough. I took it again. I actually got a 1510, and I was like, okay, that's the wrong way. So I took it again, and then got a 1600. That's the type of personality I had, and I've definitely chilled out a bit more
Mhm.
since those days.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think having adults who believe in you, your parents and other teachers and coaches, is the best predictor, I think, for, at least that I've seen, for if you're able to succeed in these ways.
I mean, for parents listening, is there anything else besides what you've said you think? Are there any types of programs, or is there any type of reading you were doing, or extracurriculars, or other, you know, like having a laptop or having the right technology at home, or like your co-founder self-taught coding? Like there's these certain, like, do you get on the internet at a fairly young age where you can like start to learn stuff and kind of teach yourself things? Those are some things that have helped me and other people, other entrepreneurs. So I'm curious if there are any other things you'd recommend.
Yeah, I mean, the caveat, I'm not a parent, so I don't know anything about
Yeah.
that. But I would say, from my perspective, you know, I highly recommend that book Grit by Angela Duckworth. It
Okay.
talks about people developing passions after going through and learning something. For me, it was chess. Chess was a big
Oh,
part of my
interesting.
life early on because you know, it taught me to think multiple steps ahead
Mhm.
and think very logically. And then also gave me the confidence because, you know, as a 10-year-old chess player, I was playing in tournaments and you're playing like 50-year-olds and stuff. And so
Wow.
similarly, and I was playing like 10, like I had a 6-year-old killed me, like his name Jeff Haskell. I still remember that. It just screamed me, the 6-year-old. I think when I was 15 or something. So, you know, it's not about age, it's about like, you know, your capabilities. And I think the team sports, obviously I play tennis, were also really helpful, but chess was something different where like it was just you, your opponent, and the board. It's
Mhm.
very much, you know, kind of took away a lot of the variables that sometimes happen. Like if you're like a gymnast, like you may just get a bad call from a judge, but chess, it's pretty pure.
I think with the LSAT and with the GMAT, there's that, and with SAT, ACT, there's that like getting that formal thinking and that logical thinking, like getting really comfortable with that. And it conceivably never really comes up as a major thing in any class you would take in high school or even college, unless you're taking a logic class. So it's same thing with statistics. One of your interviews, you mentioned like there's too much algebra, not enough statistics. So there's these certain like not making these statistical mistakes, kind of understanding how to do that, and that works into research as well. But also just logical thinking and like not making. They're trying to train you to not use the heuristics or have the cognitive biases that are going to make you leap to the wrong conclusions.
Totally. Yeah. How to decide is the core thing we should be teaching kids. And if any age, really, like decision
Yeah.
making, statistics, probabilistic thinking, etc.
Well, I wanted to actually jump ahead because there's the let me see if I can get this right. You've got the year of the zebra, um, and there's a saying which is if you hear um, what is it? If you
Beats.
hear gallop
Yeah.
foot beats, it's it's probably a horse, not a
Horses.
zebra.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I thought it'd be cool to talk about that a little bit because that's kind of an example of cognitive bias and also just wanting to find the kind of cool thing and shiny object syndrome.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is Bayesian probability or Bayesian thinking, where like you tend to weight based on your priors. So certainly, like, you know, this morning I went on a walk, and you know, if you know, there's bunnies all over the place right now, in, you know, late spring, early summer, and so seeing a bunny, you know, my prior is like, yeah, that makes sense. I should see a bunny. But if I see like a lion here in the U.S., that doesn't make as much sense. And so, you know, I understand that medical adage, which is, you know, think about the more common condition, not the zebra, not the rare one. This was actually kind of the whole initiative Year of the Zebra is meant to help clinicians, medical students, nurses, doctors, etc., to think of the rare diseases because in aggregate there's 7,000 rare diseases that affect 300 million people, and so and very little money, very little education goes towards rare diseases and zebras. And so we were trying to flip the script and try to create a more equitable and diverse healthcare system by actually making sure we have a library of rare disease content, as an example.
I wanted to ask you, it said in one of your profiles that you're in Salt Lake City now. Is that right?
I was in Salt Lake, but now I'm in Baltimore, back in med school at Hopkins.
Okay. I was just wondering if there was any reason in particular, like
Yes,
is there some tech thing there or
they call it Silicon Slopes, but the main
yeah.
reason, honestly, 100%. snowboarding. That's why that's why I moved out to Utah. Nomadic. The company was totally remote, and so I had the pick of where to go.
That's
It was
awesome.
Utah or Colorado. I chose Utah because the snow was drier.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, so you go to Harvard undergrad, and then you take a gap year, and you're thinking about business school. And I think I saw somewhere you were MD, PhD track. So what made you shift out of that?
Yeah, my junior year of college, I changed from MD PhD track to MD MBA because in looking at kind of my history up until that point and doing a lot of self-reflection, I realized that I like creating and translating projects. So even my research career, I hadn't stuck to one research project for like 4 years, like or 5 years, like a PhD. I'd done summer project here, one annual project there, across neuroscience, genetic engineering, botany, chess, I mentioned, but psychology. So I don't think it was ADD. It was more just that I wanted to get a breadth of experience. And then I wanted to translate this. So I like starting things going 0 to 1, as Peter Thiel wrote in this book. Um, PhD, it's like going from like 0 to 100. And so I was, I was I was starting advisors, my parents, et cetera. And then I switched to MD MBA,
Can you
knowing that
explain
if,
that
and
actually 0 to 100? I don't get what's the analogy
oh,
there.
yeah, well, so a lot of PhDs do create like 0 to 1. They still have to do the 0 to 1. But to get your PhD, you often have to go so deep in a specific research question, not just in terms of years, like 5, 10 years, but also just in terms of your publications and the process of going so deep in that question that I just knew that type of thing. Like I'm capable of doing things for like 10 years, like Osmosis took 10 years.
Yeah.
But but we're doing so many different things as CEO of a company, right? You're doing accounting, you're doing marketing, sales, culture building. I think in PhDs they can do many different things, but generally have to go pretty deep in a question on maybe do
Right.
the same experiment 100 times. And so that's why I said 0 to 100 is they're still creating and discovering and doing something new, but it isn't enough to go to 1. They have to go deeper.
You
And
get the
so I
minimum
switched
viable
to
product, you get the traction, and then yeah, okay, I got it. So okay, so you switch there to the MBA, MD MBA,
yep.
and you'd mentioned your friends with Prerak Juthani, who's also doing that at Yale, or he just graduated. I forget where he is in that journey, but um, so when you were doing the MBA, what was that like?
Yeah, Prerak's great, by the way, and he's a first year internal medicine resident at Stanford, I think now. Um, the MBA was great. I went back to Harvard for it. I loved it. It was the first year is everyone takes the same stuff. Finance, marketing, um, and culture or leadership skills. But the second year is electives, and you can do anything you wanted. So I took a sales class. I took a international education class. I really liked it. I love the classmates in business school because many of them are late 20s and early 30s, so they're a little more formed as humans and what they want. And so you can kind of find your tribe faster in
Mhm.
business school than maybe in undergrad. Um, and then the case-based method really works. We looked at hundreds of cases of different companies, different situations. Frankly, that's where medical school has gone. There's more case-based learning as opposed to this lecture-based learning. So paradoxically, I found that HBS was much better education than Hopkins Med for learning, at least the first 2 years.
The case based approach, that originated in the law school and then kind of spread out to uh, well, I forget the order it went in of it's always been part of medicine, but in terms of teaching, uh, do you see that there's a pretty good parallel, or are there any differences in using cases in medicine uh, versus business? Because like business, for example, you can't really do clinical trials, you can't do big population level studies, so um, you have to kind of just use cases most of the time.
Yeah, it's a really good Good question. I haven't spent too much time dissecting the differences between the cases in medicine versus business, but I think you're right about one of them where, in medical school, you're learning cases on the individual patient level. So you can
Mhm.
see thousands or tens of thousands in aggregate. In business, it's organizations generally. Um, in either case, there's no counterfactual. So you don't really have the counterfactual. But I think medicine is a bit more of a science. There's obviously the art component, but I think it's a bit more of a science than business. Business, I think, is a lot more degrees of freedom and a lot more art that comes to it.
So let's get into osmosis now. How did that actually, I wanted to ask you, like, what were you doing uh, when you were preparing for step one? Like, I'm just curious, like, how were you doing the flashcards? Were you using, which videos were you using? Like that kind of stuff. I know some people will be curious
Yeah,
what
well,
your
so what's
stack was.
exactly what's funny is I did the preclinical curriculum at Hopkins Med from 2011, fall 2011 to March 2013. And then the idea was to start studying for step one. But my co-founder and I got into a tech incubator in Philly, Dream and Health, which is where we went right after. And instead of studying for step one, we went and started building the company. So we never took it. The idea was to go back and come back and take it. And in many schools, like NYU as an example, you take step one after all your clinical rotations. And so now that I'm back in med school, I'm actually going to be studying for step one. And it's kind of funny because my stack is Osmosis and UWorld. That's
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
I don't plan on using anything else. So
So does osmosis have flashcards? Does it, like, what's the capability there?
yeah, we have a comprehensive video library, over 2,000 videos. We have tens of thousands of flashcards. One of the partnerships I struck early on at Osmosis was with Prosencephalon, one of the more popular
Oh,
RT
awesome.
decks back in the day. Yeah, he's a great guy. Amrit Sidhu is his name. But since then we've done other flashcards, and then we have I think 3,000 questions in our library,
Mhm.
USMLE one and two style. So yeah, we have a pretty comprehensive. I kind of just want to use Osmosis, but we know Chandra at UWorld, and that's obviously gold standard for test
Yeah.
taking. So I'll probably use them too.
I always thought sketchy notes was kind of like, they seem to me to be the first that was kind of going in this visual mnemonics direction, and it seems like that's also a big benefit of your videos. But like, uh, to what extent have you done visual mnemonics, and like, because that stuff's very powerful, especially like memorizing pharma stuff, like where it's really tough to memorize the vocab.
Yeah, I think the book Moonwalking with Einstein
Uh-huh.
popularized a lot of these memory palaces. I mean, obviously, for centuries, people have been using memory palaces and tapping into the spatial power of memory. Mnemonic, which is our friends from the University of Arizona, Ron Robertson and uh, Ken Robertson, as well as Sketchy, Saud Siddiqui, and Andrew Berg, also friends, were the two big memory anchor mnemonic companies. Now there's a company called Pixarize too.
Mhm.
Osmosis took a bit of a different tack where we were more like Khan Academy. Literally, the team used to run Khan Academy Health and Medicine. Um, but a lot of our videos in farm and micro do end with these type of mnemonics. It's just not the
Okay.
it's not like the main part of the product. It's a nice add-on.
Is there a reason why you haven't gone in that direction?
I'll say so. The best mnemonics, I think, are patient stories and patient
Okay.
encounters. So I know obviously it's very effective to learn and regurgitate information on a test in a memory palace framework. But honestly, the way things are going with AI and have been going for many years with clinical decision support, I could never get motivated about personally as a learner, but also as the CEO of a education tech company, in betting our company on just straight up memorize, regurgitate,
Right.
right? Like it just never appealed. I prefer a physician who got a lower step score, but was much better with bedside manner and with
Yeah.
actually using AI tools than a physician who like got the 280 on step one, but like it's kind of autistic to talk to or doesn't actually want to use step one. Like if they're doing it in their memory and aren't using clinical key
Yeah.
or up to date, I don't want that clinician.
And there's actually been studies that show that step one is not, your score is not correlated to your eventual quality as a physician. So it's not just like opinions of some people. They've actually shown that trying to max out your step score can be counterproductive at scale. So, um,
Exactly.
There's also the step two clinical skills. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that? Because that is the more social. They added that for that reason.
I know step two CS had some controversy because, very much in theory it's I think it's more meant for like people who've immigrated here, maybe who want to level set English proficiency and interview skills with the patient. But if you're coming out of a US med school, like that's kind of what you do. Like you have to be seeing
Mm-hmm.
patients, like to even graduate, to pass your clinical rotations, you have to be able to do that stuff. So it felt a bit redundant.
Mm-hmm.
um but again, I haven't taken it yet, but I do know the people who helped develop it, and I think they've adjusted it well.
Um, the other thing is like, what do you do about this trade off of sometimes the things that are most effective are the hardest and kind of most boring things to do? So, like, I find that the flashcards, maybe the memory palace stuff, like, it's not generally, unless you've got the right mindset, it's generally not enjoyable. And so, when you're selling to consumers and they're kind of there's almost kind of, they want the easy thing, they want the candy. And so how do you how do you balance like not giving them candy, and like they think that they're learning and it feels like something's happening but it's not as effective?
Yeah, the researcher Bjork popularized this term deliberate discomfort, and when you're trying to learn, where like because when you do a test question, you miss it, which is very frustrating, but then you review what you missed. That's actually one of the most effective ways to learn. And so you want to challenge yourself, and that, and the opposite side of that is growth and learning.
Mm-hmm.
I think the solution for education technology platforms has been more gamification,
Mm-hmm.
and tapping into that. So obviously, Duolingo, I think, is the leader here. They've popularized a lot of gamification and language learning, and so we've obviously benefited from some of those techniques as well.
And
But
Khan
certainly,
Academy has mastery learning. Do you use that, or do you want it planning on?
yeah, we do some of that.
Okay.
Where it kind of adapts what we send people based on how they're performing and what they want to do, what career they want to go into. Um, but I'll be honest, like people do like the videos a lot because
Yeah.
it's instead of a 60-minute video, it's a 5-minute video, and that's still a passive. Just watching an osmosis video is wonderful, but it's still passive. You ultimately have to test yourself.
Mm-hmm. So I want to talk about this idea of going to med school online. There is a bit of a push towards um, going to law school online. Kim Kardashian is in California doing the self-payment thing, and I've done some videos on that. And that's how a lot of Abraham Lincoln, a lot of other people, lawyers didn't used to go to med school, and doctor, even before the Flexner Report, and they cleaned things up. There was a lot of there were just these independent med schools. So I'm curious, like, in one of the other interviews, you talked about like there's some stuff you can get at home, there's some stuff that you could do with VR and virtualization, and then there's things that need to be done at a hospital or some kind of healthcare system. So could you kind of give us and you actually, I'm blanking on exactly what the subject of your TED talk was, but this was part of your TED talk. So like, what is your most up to date understanding of like, if there's these three buckets of at home and then VR, and then you have to actually be there, like you have to go do anatomy and work with cadavers, like where are we in those three buckets? And is that even the right way to break it down?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting question. And I think the whole framework I was pitching in that TEDx talk and the Forbes article, which is could you get an MD online, was that so much of learning medicine, whether it's medical school, nursing school, pharmacy, etc., is didactic. You have to spend a lot of time just learning, what is the citric acid cycle? What is the side effect of metformin? And for many, many learners, just like many employees who've shifted to distributed work or remote work, they can save a lot of money. They can save a lot of time by just being able to do that on their own. There's micro learning, whether it's in between sets at the gym, and they're like quizzing themselves in flashcards. It's commuting, to the hospital where they're working as a scribe. They can listen to a podcast or an osmosis video. Um, and the great unlock of taking this didactic information and turning it online is that for many learners who've been shut out of a time-based and expensive MD program, a four-year MD program where you have to spend 2 years and $150,000 in that, basically sitting in lecture or even skipping lecture, you
Mhm.
could potentially do a lot of that maybe in 5 years part-time online. And
Right.
then say you did that and then took step one and proved that you have the knowledge to then go into the clinic. Maybe we can kind of get part-time learners, adult learners into these pathway programs with less money involved. And so that was the promise. It's not for everyone. And
Mhm.
certainly there is no accredited online MD program right now. The closest I've seen is Oceania University School of Medicine out in the Pacific, that does a lot of online training and then like contracts with hospitals to do the clinical rotations. And there's some implementations here and there. But I've also seen NYU, at Vermont, and now even at Hopkins, there's no required lecture. There's no required in-person lecture anymore.
Yeah.
It's all virtual, oftentimes with Osmosis videos being sent out. As far as the VR, I think VR and AR are very good for that transition between kind of test questions, didactic knowledge, and then before you see a patient because you may not be ready. Or in the case of my friend Justin Barad, who runs OSO VR, for surgical simulations, right? Because
Could you spell
if you
that
can
out? Because
use
I think
surg
people want to
oh,
look that up.
yeah, it's OSSO VR, also VR,
Mhm.
or OSO VR. And my friend's name is Justin Barad. He's the CEO and orthopedic surgeon. So I think for like surgical training, VR can be very helpful for like regular practice, even by very skilled orthopedic surgeons, because instead of doing, it on a live patient, they can rehearse it in there with a VR tool, hundreds of times before going into the actual OR. Um, and even at Elsevier now we have this tool called SurePath, or Shadow Health, which does simulated patient encounters. But then ultimately, it's what I shared in my I gave a talk about why I'm back to med school on the YouTube channel. And I put the quote from William Osler, who's one of the founders of Hopkins, who said something like, he who studies medicine without books sails an uncharted sea, and he who studies medicine without patients doesn't go to sea at all." So I think ultimately you clearly have to go see patients in practice because that's who you're working with.
Mhm.
Even in the age of telemedicine, you have to see patients.
Um, One of the interesting thing about Johns Hopkins is that they really brought the whole idea of the German research university to the United States. And I forget the history of how the medical school. Do you know that history of like of why they're considered so good, or why they have such a great reputation?
Yeah, it was in the late 1800s. There was this kind of like explosion of medical schools that many of which were unaccredited,
Right.
and some of these were like snake oil type places, kind of degree mills and stuff. And
Mhm.
so there was a guy named Abraham Flexner who was commissioned to study a bunch of schools and figure out what the optimal model is. And he, in 1912, published this Flexner Report, which I think 1910 or 1912 set the tone and basically said Hopkins had the best model that he had seen, which was 2 years of preclinical textbook learning, followed by 2 years of apprenticeship, which was pioneered by William Osler. The term resident comes from William Osler because he used to have his residents live at the hospital and reside there, and basically come and study and work with him on patients he was seeing. So that seemed to be the best approach at the time. But 100 years later, Hopkins was still talking about the Flexner Report, and we wanted to question whether you still needed 2 years of preclinical, 2 years of clinical. Now it's gone to be like a asynchronous preclinical, and then 2 or more years of clinical.
I mean, so much of the stress of higher education seems to be the time crunch of like, you have to do this in 1 year, you have to do this in a semester, and you have to do, you have these suicides, you have all this stress of med students, and like suicide rates are actually higher among physicians than like the normal population, and med school students, I would assume the same. And it's all this stress, all this pressure. And to me, from the outside looking in, it looks like I know there is a huge shortage, and you've talked about that in your TED talk as well. But in an ideal world, there's no reason to be like cramming this knowledge down people's throats when you can just spread it out. And it's like people want to take a gap year anyway. They want to do stuff. Like, people want Netflix, they want to kind of control their time and do things on their own schedule. Why do we need to force people to do these insane kind of Herculean feats when it's a lot of it's just not necessary? That's my
Yeah,
my take.
I think so. I mean, we're seeing this in the work environment, right? Like, why even have a Zoom meeting when you can use a Loom video, and then record an
Yeah.
asynchronous video and send that out. So I think that's where we're going. I think there's more flexibility, and I think more importantly, this type of flexibility, competency-based education, will open the doors for a more diverse pipeline of people to come into medicine,
Mhm.
right? Because again, to take 4 years off to spend $200,000, only a select few people can do that, right?
Mhm.
Whereas, for example, when I went to the Caribbean to visit one of the schools we work with down there, I met this 55-year-old guy who was a respiratory therapist for over 20 years, and he went to med school day one, starting back to scratch biochemistry, because he wanted to become a pulmonologist. And there's
Mhm.
no way he could go from respiratory therapist to maybe do like a year of intensive, switch to MD program and then a residency in pulmonology or internal medicine pulmonology. He had to go day one back to biochemistry and go to the Caribbean to get this done.
Wow.
It's kind of silly. It kind of discounts the 20 plus years he actually spent treating patients with respiratory conditions.
You mentioned in, I think, one of your talks that your co-founder had studied uh, neurology or something, or like had a PhD in it, and he couldn't test out of the class, and he could have taught the class.
Yeah.
So I thought that was pretty funny. And like, I had a med student who I was coaching through step one stuff, and like, she had recently gotten married, and like, just the decision of like, when can I have kids, and like, where is there, like, you can't, there's no wiggle room. And she was trained to become a surgeon, she wanted to be the head of a hospital, and so she had these really big dreams, and it was like, where do you fit life in? Like, anything that's outside of this perfect path is unnecessarily difficult, and so only certain types of people who are really well situated can, and just for whatever reason don't get stressed out, or whatever, they are the ones who go straight through, and there just isn't a great reason for it. So I think a lot of this stuff, I think COVID kind of opened people's eyes to things, and but myself teaching online and Udemy, it's always seemed to me like there's eventually going to be that kind of next Netflix moment where people realize, hey, like, we don't have to keep doing it this way.
I think that's a really good point. And I think for the average, for like, the general physician we want to train, I do think there's a counterpoint where, like, if you want to be like the best, neurosurgeon out there,
Yeah.
the best neurosurgeon, right? You got to get the reps in, right? So like the work-life balance for certain careers, are it may just be absent. And I'm a huge fan. Have you read the book by Naval Ravikant, The Almanac of Naval
Yeah.
Ravikant?
Yep.
Yep, great book. And he uses the analogy that there's times in your life where you're the lion who's hunting, like you're working really hard, you're sprinting, you're nose to the grindstone, and then there's other times when you're the lion that's sleeping and resting, right? So just rather than assuming you have a 50-year lifespan of 9 to 5, where you're just kind of like in this medium place, you may have 4 years where you're like, you know 7 to 7 and weekends while you're building something or getting to be, getting your PhD in something or whatever.
Mhm.
And then you're resting a little bit. And then, you kind of go in and out. And I think that's part of the beauty of life is I'm not saying everyone should do competency-based online medical training. We don't want to get rid of the time-based in person. It's
Yeah.
just the optionality is important.
I mean, what was funny to me is, and I had a conversation with the same woman, and we were getting into like, how should I, she was like, how do I organize my OneNote to like store the stuff I'm learning for my surgery stuff versus the step one? And I was like, well, we can structure it according to this taxonomy of medical knowledge. And she said, well, really all this stuff I'm learning for step one, nobody tries to remember it or go back to it after they take step one. It's basically, a lot of it is almost throwaway knowledge. And I don't have a great perspective to know exactly how true that is, but like, there's also this question of, are we just learning stuff to, because like it was hard, like that's the gauntlet other people had to go through, and you're not going to retain it. And so what's the point, like algebra, like what's the point of learning this stuff, memorizing it, and then forgetting it? Because that was my experience through school, was a lot of this stuff, there isn't the spaced repetition lifelong where it's actually going to be there. So the value of, being able to recognize it if you see it in a medical form, or somebody mentions a word in the future, there is some marginal value there. But um, sending people through this traditional path, I'm just curious what you like, as opposed to competency based, where it's like, here's the test, here's what people really do need to know, physicians, and then let's test them on that. And if they really need to know it, then they need to retain it over time, and maybe they need to be tested for the rest of their life on that knowledge, which I don't think is happening right now. It is to an extent. For specialties, you need to get those repeated tests. But do you have thoughts on that sort of thing?
I think my view, and this is partly going back to the SAT ACT test and interest there. Same with MCAT, USMLE, is that the test serves two functions. One is just economics, supply demand. More people want to go to med school than there are spaces for med school. So having an objective numeric way to kind of
Mm-hmm.
assess less about, I mean, knowledge is assessed, but also just kind of grit. Like,
Mm-hmm.
do you just want, like, will you put your nose to the grindstone for 10 weeks and study 8 hours a day and get a step score?
Right.
So like you're kind of, that's where you're assessing the meta value there. And also partially socioeconomic status. Can someone take that much time? Can they spend that much money on these different quizzes and tests and
Mm-hmm.
platforms? So that's one reason for any testing. The second reason is I think it's a forcing function to get students who otherwise would have no structure to develop a baseline level of knowledge. So we have thesauruses, we have dictionaries. Why do you have to like learn spelling and vocabulary? It's because if you had to use a thesaurus or dictionary for every single word you write in an essay, it would take you forever.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have no working knowledge as a clinician of the things you learned from step 2 CS
Mm-hmm.
or step 2 CK, you may just be like a really slow clinician, even if you have a great clinical decision support tool or a AI or whatever it is. So I think that's the second and probably more important reason why we have these forcing functions. But you're right that someone who becomes a dermatologist probably can forget most everything about everything else, right? Because they're only seeing
Yeah.
skin cancers all the time. And then there, the American Board of Dermatology needs to get people to keep updating their knowledge through continuous formative assessment and quality guidelines. So they're practicing at the high quality care.
So I'm curious, just in regular life, but also professionally, just what do you have, like a second brain? Do you have a Notion or OneNote? Like what are the main tech things you're using? How do you read books? Do you take online Udemy courses or other kind of premium stuff, masterminds? Do you get coaching? Like what are the big things for you, and what's the overall structure?
Yeah, it depends on the season. So
Mhm.
like it's I went when I was really into reading. I was reading Audible 2 or 3 books a week while I go to the gym. I was really intense, like picking up a
Mhm.
lot of diverse knowledge. Now I don't read that often. I reread some of the books I found very valuable. Um, Stoicism and Naval Ravikant's book is mentioned. I'm also podcasting a bit more now. I'm listening to more podcasts. So it just depends on what your goals are and what your objectives are. And for me, there was a period of my life of like hardcore reading. Actually, that's happened a couple of times. It probably will happen again in a few years. As far as my note taking, I mostly actually use notes. I use the notes function.
Apple
I know
Notes.
I tried, yeah, Apple Notes. Um, I, have a pretty good memory. Well, like remember I wrote something back then, or I use email as a to-do list.
Mhm.
So it's not like a fully optimized thing. But have you seen that meme of the normal distribution where like
Yeah,
on one end, I feel that
the
very
midwit and
acutely
then
where
the advanced with
the
the hood on.
Jedi, yeah, exactly. The nitwit and the Jedi do the same exact thing
Yeah.
for different reasons, and so I feel that very acutely because I was like in the middle of like, oh, I sleep 5 hours and I like wake up and I do XYZ thing, and I still fall into that. But like the nitwit will be like, I sleep 8 hours, I wake up whenever I want.
Yeah. Yeah.
The Jedi will say the same thing. I sleep 8 hours, I wake up whenever I want. And it's like they have different reasons for it, but you kind of have to go through the
So what
pain
are
and the
your
hustle of the
reasons
middle.
for just using notes and like other keeping it pretty simple?
Exactly that. Occam's razor, keeping it simple. Like
Yeah.
the cost of the mental burden of trying to overcomplicate how I take notes, or optimizing 50 different parts of my life when I don't even have time to like look at the 30,000 foot view or
Mhm.
enjoy life. That was a big realization, especially over the last year or so.
What about finding stuff? Like that's probably my main justification is like I agree if you can't find stuff, then it's basically useless to take the notes. But like if you take notes on something and a year or two goes by, how do you go back and find those?
Yeah, I mean, um, I'll try remembering it, or I'll try. I know, like I kind of have a rough sense, and I use the search feature in Apple to find it. Like I
Mhm.
know I wrote a business idea around XYZ thing, and I like find it. But part of me is just kind of, if it may not have been that important to begin with,
Yeah.
I let it go away, right?
Yeah, that's often. So I actually want to ask you: have you thought about doing anything in pharma? Because one of your interviews or one of your things you said, like, I don't know if I'm going to even make it through med school again, like straight through. I might like take another leave and go start another business. So I could definitely see you doing that. I was wondering if you thought about pharma at all, investing. I mean, you could easily get into investing in companies, investing in rare disease trials and stuff like that. So I've been following Vivek Ramaswamy's presidential thing, and I read his New Yorker. There was a New Yorker profile about how he made his money and his kind of path through pharma. So I was curious if you had thought about investing at all or doing something in pharma.
Small world is that I knew him briefly in college. I was actually better friends with his brother, Shankar,
Where
and
did
we
he do
danced together in the
undergrad? Because he
city.
was Yale
He's
Law,
at
but
Harvard, yeah,
he was at
he was
Harvard. Oh
Harvard
yeah,
grad too.
yep,
Yeah,
yep.
but he was graduating, like I think he was a senior when I was a freshman.
Okay.
Um, and his brother was, I think, a year below me or 2 years below me. So yeah, I mean, this is the paradox of choice. There's so many things you could do, and that's partly why I've been very upfront with when my article about why I'm going back to med school and my talk, that I may not finish, right? Like I don't want to be like, yeah, now definitely I'm going to finish, because the last time I was definitely going to finish. I did
But
two
aren't
years
these
and
the
then
easy
started
years?
osmosis.
Like the three and four, the like electives and like I don't know.
Yeah. Well, the clinical rotations I think can be challenging just from a time perspective, and
Yeah.
you're in the clinic, but um yeah, even if it's easy, like it could be 6 months from now, lightning strikes, I want to work on something else. Like, so I want to be super open minded. It would be kind of
Yeah.
hypocritical for me to be like, I'm definitely finishing now. And like, so I just want to keep that door open.
Mhm.
I'm partly why I've gone back to med school is because I'm interested in AI and psychedelics.
Oh,
Those are two
really?
of the things I'm
Yeah, I
most
want to
interested
ask you
in.
about that.
And Hopkins has like two of the leading research, programs for both of those. So
Is that where
that's where
Tim
largely,
Ferriss did something? Does he have?
yeah,
Can you
Tim
talk about
Ferriss.
that?
I don't know the specifics of what Tim Ferriss did, but I know he's close friends with the founder of the Hopkins Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research, a guy named Roland Griffiths.
I think he donated like
So
$1 million or something a few years ago, or
yeah,
something, or raised some
exactly.
money
Yeah.
for them. Yeah. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about AI and then let's talk about psychedelics.
Cool.
So
My
like
favorite
what's your
subjects.
what's your interest in I think there was something with ChatGPT somewhere I saw in my research. Are you what do you think I know there's Harvey AI for law AI. I haven't seen as much like the killer app for med AI yet, but what's your interest in AI with medicine?
Yeah, I mean AI in medicine, long history, right? Like image recognition software for dermatology and radiology has been of interest for many years. Again, going back to my biomedical engineering days, I've been pretty interested in this for a while, but only in recent years, and particularly recent months, has it captured the imagination where we have these breakthroughs in large language models because of the GPT, or the transformer architecture that came out in 2017. And so now that we can have these generative AI models that can, for example, listen to this conversation that we're having
Mhm.
and automatically document it into show notes, into a blog, into LinkedIn posts. It can, kind of transform the medium. We could simulate most of this conversation with our voices.
Mhm.
There's so many things you could do, because you can imagine, like, you're my physician, I'm your patient, you're asking me questions. That's going to be your automatic soap note, right? And
Mhm.
then maybe it just requires a physician to review. So I'm very interested in healthcare applications for AI, and on my own podcast, I'm having several healthcare AI leaders. I've had Eric Topol on. I'm inviting several others to join. I'll be in San Diego for the AI Med conference coming up.
Let's do a little plug for that, actually, because I was looking. You have like
Yeah.
over 350 people on that podcast, and you've almost like kind of like networked through all the important people in medicine with that podcast. That's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, you know this from your podcast too. Like, yeah,
Yeah.
it's definitely it's called Raise the Line. We interview leaders in healthcare and education around how we can strengthen our healthcare system. So the most famous person we had on is probably Mark Cuban. But then, we've had some leaders like Ashish Jha and Eric Topol, as mentioned.
Mhm.
Just today, I had a call with the interview with the dean, the president of East Carolina University Health System, and the
Oh
dean of
wow,
the Brody School of Medicine.
that's awesome.
So it's been a great way to like learn from them what they're seeing, and then you know that influences what we build at Osmosis. That influences what I decide to pursue as a career. So um, yeah, AI has been just fascinating, and like I've been
It's
using
kind of
it
funny is that
daily.
like one of the things Ali Abdal talked about in terms of leaving medicine is like a huge amount of it is you're almost just like a data entry person, like filling out forms and like writing up I forget what they're called, but like the sending somebody somewhere else the notes you do for that. It's like the 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 notes you fill out on a patient's status before you send them to another department or another specialist. So like there's a ton of stuff that doesn't take like an AI could do that and really free up the physician to be doing stuff with patients. And right now, a huge amount of their time is not with patients and doing this kind of grunt work that's really boring and kind of soul deadening.
Totally, one hundred
And you
percent.
mentioned the AI, the scribe thing, which is kind of like when you're a med student or even before, you can be a medical scribe and kind of take notes. Like the doctor can be like record notes or make an audio recording that gets turned into whatever notes that need to be done. Then the physician doesn't have to do that. So that seemed to me like one of the most obvious game changing things. And it would help uh, with this shortage of doctors and healthcare professionals you've talked about. Um, okay, so let's talk about psychedelics. What's your interest in that? And yeah, there's a lot of different directions.
Yeah, totally. So psychedelics are um, one of the most promising therapies for a whole host of mental health issues, ranging from depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, eating disorders, and even other not necessarily mental health disorders, but dementia, stroke, things that require some more neuroplasticity. And so I've been following the space for some time. Obviously, Michael Pollan wrote that book, How to Change Your Mind, which I recommend. You've probably read it. That's popularized psychedelics,
Yep.
and he has
Yep.
a whole Netflix docu-series about it. Um, and I think I'm interested both from the perspective of how do we take people who have these conditions, diagnosable conditions, and bring them to so-called normal. But then
Mhm.
also, how do you take people who are like normal or flourishing and make them thrive, right? So take an average person who like maybe they get sad once in a while, but they're also very creative, and like get them to be even more creative, help them be even more creative. And I actually see an overlap between AI and psychedelics, where AI will change what humans do day to day, right? Like it will replace a lot of what knowledge work is, and
Mhm.
there'll be new jobs and new ways to apply creative knowledge work. But I think psychedelics are a good way to help those people who will be displaced and they need to find meaning, belonging, purpose. I think psychedelics could help with them too, which is again one reason Hopkins is so exciting. There's a guy named Dr. David Yaden, along with Dr. Roland Griffiths, who are focused on that aspect as well, not just psychedelics for pathological conditions, but for human flourishing and positive psychology.
Yeah. So that's kind of what positive psychology was. Who's the? Is it? It's not Frankel, is it, or somebody else who came up with positive psychology?
Martin Seligman is
Yeah,
one of the
Seligman.
guys who's best known. Yeah, at Penn. Yep. And
So
actually,
that,
Yaden worked with Seligman. Yep.
oh, really? So, yeah, so Seligman, his big thing is all of psychology has been looking at people who are dysfunctional, but there hasn't been a lot of focus on modeling people who are really thriving and flourishing. And what are they doing? How can we model that and help you? Because Freud always said, like, this is just going to take you from dysfunctional to kind of normal. It's not going to take you beyond that. And so the positive psychology stuff um, has been that next logical step. Um, is there anything else in terms of psychedelics that you're looking at, or any other things people should check out?
Definitely, if they look at our podcast, we have several leaders on and that space coming out.
Mhm.
So, yeah, and as with anyone who may be listening to this, I welcome them to reach out to me on LinkedIn or
Mhm.
shiv@osmosis.org, and if they're interested in that, we can talk about it.
So I haven't read the Michael Pollan book. I'm familiar with it, but if people want, there's a website called Arrowid, and they have, I think, the biggest collection of trip reports. So if you're wondering,
Right.
like, what do people experience when they actually take these substances, especially at a higher level, but there's a whole range of it. Arrowid is basically where people go and write these narratives of what they experienced, what it was like, which drug they took, how much. And so it gives you more of that first person perspective of uh, and actually, you know what, the kind of the funny thing about this, a lot of this AI art is it kind of, some of it has that uncanny valley feeling, or of like that kind of psychedelic. um do you have any insights or thoughts about that, like how AI art kind of naturally has has this somewhat psychedelic effect to it? Like, I always thought that was kind of interesting.
Like a mid journey, like what when it produces a mid journey.
Yeah, or even like the videos. If you see these videos of like text to video transformers where it doesn't have an underlying three-dimensional model, that it's like when it's flying through a beach scene, it's not a consistent beach. It's trying to predict the next few frames.
Mm.
And so the actual underlying reality has this shape-shifting effect that's very uncanny, and you would never, to develop that in three, like with a 3D software, would be extremely difficult. So it's like something you would only get from some kind of neural net or some kind of thing like that. So I just thought that was kind of interesting, that parallel.
That's fascinating. I got to see some of that, but certainly, like we could talk for hours about this, and I would love to because I think there's a great. I don't know if you follow Sam Harris.
Yep.
Do you?
Yeah,
Yep. So
definitely.
he just had this great guest on Shamil something Chindaria, I believe, at Oxford, who talks about the parallels between uh, neural nets. I mean, how neural nets work. He was an advisor to Google DeepBrain and the actual brain. And what psychedelics will often do to the brain is they'll modify your, like we talked about this, they'll quiet the default mode network so that you're able to kind of re look at the same set of facts that you would normally look at before and view them differently, right?
Mm-hmm.
So similarly, when we're generating AI art, potentially it could be something where you're it's going through a similar process the brain goes through when it's on psychedelics. um Still early on, but I think it's definitely worth exploring.
Yeah, it, like with these LLMs, they've got the kind of mesh to them, but they have hallucinations, and they're not chain of reasoning stuff. Like, they're not necessarily, they don't have that other piece that the human brain has, where you kind of impose the rigorous logical structure, and don't let your, so like the stuff we talk about with SATs, for example, and GMAT, you're developing that other side of your brain that kind of imposes that structure on the more creative side. And the danger is that can become too powerful, and so you can kind of push in the other direction, and getting the right balance of those two is the ideal. So with these LLMs, I mean, the expert system stuff of 20, 30 years ago, that was the logical rigorous side, and they realized that can only take you so far because there's so much ambiguity in reasoning. And And like with medical diagnosis, for example, you've got all these variables. You have to have some kind of neural net thing to do some of the guesstimation. And so now I feel like we're bringing some of that expert system stuff back. And once that gets melded in, because like some of the biggest expert system stuff was medical diagnosis and um, prescribing and stuff like that and legal stuff, but like it still couldn't figure out all this other stuff. So it feels like now those two are coming together, and that's where maybe AGI like fully kicks off. So
It's the coolest stuff, man. Like this
yeah.
is a crazy world we live in right now. So
So I wanted to ask you. There's this guy named John Sotos, MD, and he wrote a book called Zebra Cards. And I just thought of it because you have the year of the zebra. He has a website that he's like done the most detailed, or one of the most detailed online medical profiles of all US presidents. And so he's looked at each US president. There's like a profile every it's actually listed, it's linked to from the Library of Congress.gov website as like the first link that they save for health stuff of presidents. And like FDR was basically out of commission the last 6 years, 6 months of his life, roughly. And like a lot of presidents have had health issues that they've hid or dealt with privately. And there's just a lot of cool stuff there. And so he also wrote a book called Zebra Cards, and I was curious if you had ever come across that, or and if you could just talk a little bit more about like you climbed Kilimanjaro and like some of this other stuff you've done. Like what what's the, like you said there's 7,000 of these diseases, 3 million affected, but like what are you doing about it besides just bringing awareness? Like what's the bigger agenda here?
yeah, totally. So thanks for sharing that. I was just looking up zebra cards. I have not seen John Soto's, but I'm definitely going to follow up and look up. I mean,
I think it was
agree.
more popular like 10 or 20 years ago because I think it was published a little while ago.
Cool. Well, that's cool to know. I didn't know about it. So yeah, the year of the zebra. We've been working at Osmosis with the National Organization for Rare Disorders for several years, developing videos on these conditions. So far, we've made 200 videos of the 7,000 rare disorders. Those 200 videos have been seen by 35 million people. So the big component is how do we go from 200 videos to hundreds more, or thousands more? I think AI will actually help us generate these videos faster and at scale. Um, we have a strong partnership with YouTube Health, their health division, and the CEO of YouTube, Neil Mohan, actually shared Year of the Zebra on February 28th because YouTube itself has funded us to create more rare disease content. So the goal would be to eventually get a
Can you
video on
clarify that?
osmosis.
Because I thought that was just your thing with Year of the Zebra, but this is like an YouTube, like who originated this whole idea?
So we did at Osmosis.
Oh,
We
you
came
did.
up with,
Okay.
yeah, we did come up with the Year of the Zebra.
Okay.
But the National Organization for Rare Disorders was founded in 1983, 40 years ago, as it was working to create this thing called the Orphan Drug Act. So the Year of the Zebra, the reason it's this year, not next year, is that it's the 40th anniversary of the Orphan Drug Act and the National Organization for Rare Disorders. So we brought together several partners. YouTube is one of them, but also Coveras, which is a large medical malpractice insurance company that invested in Osmosis, helped us grow. And then Elsevier, which bought Osmosis, has been doing work in rare diseases for a long time. So one component is awareness and education. So every week we release a new zebra video to hundreds of thousands or millions of people, depending on, it's a newsletter or it's YouTube or Osmosis. But then also Elsevier has launched an open access rare disease journal called Rare. So to get more scientists and patients publishing papers about rare disorders in that journal. Then there's this other division of Elsevier that we've gotten to know and work with that is trying to find in silico drug targets for different rare diseases too, because a lot of Elsevier's clients are these pharma companies that do drug research. And so it's multifaceted what we're trying to do with Year of the Zebra, but my hat is primarily around education and awareness.
Okay. Um, so one other question, you've done the Kilimanjaro thing. You obviously go to the gym, seen from your Twitter picture. So like, I'm curious, just like what your workout routine is, or like what your overall kind of athletic side of you, because I think that's pretty important, and like it's obviously something you focus a fair amount on.
Yeah, it's been obviously a huge unlock for me. You think better, you perform better, you have more confidence, all sorts of stuff. So for me, it's strength training 4 days a week. And so the three things really are caloric deficit. 20% caloric deficit generally is what I aim for. Not like that all the time, especially when I'm traveling. High protein, a gram per pound of protein, and strength training for
But
at
I mean,
least.
are you always in deficit? Because you seem like a pretty trim guy. Like, are you trying to cut even more? Or?
Yeah, well, I probably have body dysmorphia where I'm like I'm always trying to cut a bit, but I've become a little more trying to be a bit more balanced with it. So I go between periods of caloric deficit and then
Yeah.
maintenance, but
What's
generally
your
I
body fat goal? What body fat percentage
so I
goal?
did my DEXA scans. It's 17 and a half right now,
Okay.
but I'd like it to be closer to 12.
Okay.
So yeah. Um, but yeah, for all sorts of reasons. I mean, it's some vanity, but also just confidence. Like it's a really confidence builder when I'm like, okay, I have this like centering thing for myself.
Yeah.
And also I've double dipped, right? You read a lot, and
Yeah.
your strength training is a great place to read, I find. Like as I'm
Really,
lifting
I've never.
weights, and then I
You're listening to audiobooks or podcasts?
podcasts or audiobooks while I'm lifting. Yeah. Um, cardio I couldn't. Cardio I got to listen to like rock or EDM or something. But but when I'm strength training, it's slow enough that I can like truly understand what someone is saying in a book. So
That's kind of funny because I'm the opposite. Like, if I'm on my bike ride, I can. That's how I get my cardio, and I can do like an audiobook there. But when I'm lifting, I'm like I need that pump up of the EDM or the rock to like hit a PR or
interesting.
something. So,
That's
um,
interesting. I should
yeah,
try that. I should flip it around one day.
I don't know. I'm in a mode right now, and I've heard some advice that like you just should go super heavy to grow more. And I've hit some plateaus, so I've like I never really did much swinging, and like I'm getting like trying it out a little bit without like pulling my shoulders out of my sockets. So
Like kettlebells or
no, just dumbbells. And like I focus a lot on curling and overhead press stuff, and so it puts a I hit a plateau with my curling at like 55 pound curls like this, and I recently broke through it, and I was just doing like I've been learning a lot about like these special exercises that arm wrestlers do, where they work the wrist and they work the forearms, and they do partial, very heavy reps of like
huh.
almost double what you could do otherwise, and they kind of keep their elbow locked and they go like this, and that kind of helps build up the different segments um of things. And I also do dance where there's some lifting components where you lift the girl, and like you need a fair amount of that curling and pressing, so it helps with that as well. And so I've got like my main song right now is Sober by Tool, and there's this like really great ramp up at the beginning, and like when I'm about to go for a PR, I turn that on, and like there's a 10 or 20-second wait, and then I go for it. um so that's kind of
That's
uh
awesome.
yeah.
We should exchange notes. I'd love to know where you're getting this and who you're following.
Yeah,
And by
well,
the way,
if
I
I'm
love
ever,
Tool too.
you're in Philadelphia
Baltimore now,
or
yeah.
Baltimore. If I'm ever in Baltimore, we should go to the gym and
Please.
exchange notes. Everything out of now that COVID is, officially over with, as they say, at least the emergency. I'm getting back out more and doing some traveling. So
Come visit.
that'd be
Yeah, I'd
really
love
fun
that.
to do. And yeah, so we can wrap up here. Actually, the one other thing that really surprised me is a stat. I'll have to find the source of it, but it was that like the people think Sudoku and crosswords are like these great ways to keep your brain active and like prevent aging and that like steady decline once you hit 27 to 30. And they found that weightlifting specifically and dancing are like two of the most effective things to stave off cognitive decline. And so
Hmm.
I had always thought like weightlifting, like it was never, I had just never gotten too into it. But like once I saw that stat, it kind of triggered something for me where I was like, hey, like it's so counterintuitive, but the stats are the research is undeniable. So it's kind of a
That's
funny,
interesting.
yeah, it's
That's
kind of
also maybe something on that normal distribution, right? Because
yeah,
like growing up, pop culture was like meatheads,
yeah,
muscle heads. They aren't very smart. They're like lifting all the time in the gym. But then like the Jedi is like actually no,
yeah.
Jedi is like lifting. Like, and I think I wonder if I'd have to look at that papers if you find them and send them to me.
Yeah, definitely.
But one thing is creatine, right? Which is a
Creatine, yeah.
very well creatine is a very well studied supplement, very safe. Um, Obviously, there's some still connotations around creatine that people are getting over, but creatine's obviously very important for muscle build, like
Hmm.
for lifting to getting to those
Hmm.
PRs. Creatine also improves brain function, right? There's a lot of studies showing it improves your brain cognitive processes. So maybe there's some correlation there where you're taking those
Have you
supplements
done
for muscle
nootropic
building.
stuff at all?
Just the I do
A little
uh
Adderall
I,
here.
no, not that. Not that, but not yet. I mean, if there's compelling evidence, yeah, I would like to be interested. But
Yeah.
mostly like Legion, Mike Matthews. I like his book, bigger,
Can you
stronger,
spell
faster.
that? Ellie.
Yeah, Legion, Mike Matthews.
Okay.
His book is great, and he presents a lot of scientific studies, like Jeff Nippard, if you know him on YouTube.
Yep.
He's very scientific in his approach. Um, so
Yeah,
I
he's
would.
almost like the gold standard. Like if you really want to get the research on something, that's what I watch.
He's awesome. Yeah, really
Yeah.
good.
All right, cool. So, any final thoughts you want to leave people with? The one other thing I forgot to mention is Forbes. You were part of the Forbes 30 under 30 in 2018 in education. So, I mean, people should check out your LinkedIn because I'm not sure if I've ever seen somebody with a better resume in my life. And so, like, your story is incredible, and I want to check out more of your podcast because I'm sure there's some cool people I haven't heard of before that you've interviewed. So thanks a lot for coming
Sure.
on. And as people can find you on Twitter, you're on LinkedIn. People can reach out if they're interested in getting some mentorship from you. Is there anything else? Obviously, check out Osmosis and your YouTube channel. Is there anything else we want to point people to?
No, just exactly what you said, a bias towards action. So if
Yep.
you took the time to listen to this, like send me a note on LinkedIn, like I'm happy to connect and just appreciation. I mean, I've gone on a lot of podcasts and you've done, the top 1% of people who like actually do their research and know about
Mhm.
these things. So I'm really glad to have met you and be on your podcast. So appreciate you taking the time.
Likewise. So thanks a lot for coming on, and definitely check out. We'll put the links down below if you want to learn more about Shiv Gaglani. Thanks again.